this is a essentially a presentation on a much bigger project, which has attempted to analyze essentially a huge chunk of the Armenian lexicon, to try to see if we can tease out different co-phonologies that are nested within it. So let me quickly go. So this is going to be our outline, but again, this should be a longer lecture. But I welcome the challenge of trying to condense this as much as possible. Also, I will try to eliminate the technical jargon, which is often required for such a thing. So essentially, there are numerous lexical layers within the Armenian lexicon, which is more or less a fossil of the intercultural exchanges and the historical exchanges that the Armenian people went through from the early second millennium BCE all the way up to the early modern era. Of course, there are numerous lexical layers, although I'm exclusively focusing on the so-called Persian layers, so the layers which come from the various Iranian languages which were extant in whatever empire was south or southeast of historical Armenia. So this is essentially the model. So again, I'm gonna simplify it for the non-phonologists over here. So there are several languages such as Japanese, English, Farsi, for which such a model works. So essentially, here is a graphical representation of it, and I have a small adapted version of Ito and Mester's schema here at the bottom. So essentially, there are some languages where one can have a concentric model in which the smaller circles, if you want to call it, the smaller core lexicon are more constrained in all sorts of morphophonological ways than the concentrically larger circles. So to give a very concrete examples, all of us here have at least a solid knowledge of English. For English, you can do this. You can look at, say, the verbal system, or the older case system, or the phonemic inventory, and you can do this analysis where you can analyze Indo-European derived words. You can probably also analyze a Germanic layer that is not Indo-European, but that is Germanic within Anglo-Saxon. So this would be the Old English core. And then after 1066, you have an expansion of the vocabulary, slowly at first, but then rather quickly. This influences the phonological system. And for example, in English, if I say a word like kingly, it has a different stress pattern than, say, royal or regal, even though semantically they're rather similar. Royal comes from roi, a Norman French word, and then rex from Latin, which is a learned borrowing back into English. So over here is a vertical representation of the shorthand that I'm going to be using. So Lex 0 is the Indo-European core vocabulary. Lex 1, Lex 2, Lex 3, these are the Persian sublexicons. So essentially, you guys probably know a huge chunk of vocabulary. If I had to put a rough number, I'd say it's about 60%, derives from Parthian, a northwestern Middle Iranian language. So, and that there are 3 historically widely generalized categories or periods where we had different degrees of interaction with various, again, I'm simplifying the issue a little bit. I'm kind of lumping all Iranian languages together. So there are 3 main periods. So Lex 1 refers to the Urartian era, so pre-6th century BCE, perhaps a few centuries back, and the Achaemenid era as well. Lex 2, which is where the bulk of the vocabulary comes from, at least for this little bit here, comes from contact during the Parthian period, so roughly 200 BCE to 400 CE, and the later Sasanian period, where there was much less contact, and the loanwords from this period are not as well integrated into the Armenian lexicon. I'll get to that. So yeah, so this is more technical information, but also in case you're wondering, how was I able to categorize these lexemes into 3 different historical periods? This is, again, it's a very rough, it's a rough guesswork. I poured over lots of etymological authorities. Some of them I had to do some educated guesswork, back formations and whatnot. But so there's that big caveat, and another major caveat is that I only was able to do this for about 700 lexemes. I could have perhaps gone for more, but things get a little fuzzier the more comprehensive we want to be. I will just focus quickly on several elements that seem to be differentiated within the co-phonologies. So for example, prothesis, there is a difference in the early Armenian, in the early loans that entered Armenian from Parthian versus the later loans. For example, native words generally add an a, initial a, like in erek, yerek in modern speech. Whereas in Persian borrowings, especially middle median, we generally add a, such as ashket for reddish or chestnut colored. Here is an OT analysis. Now I do OT is optimality theory. It's this phonological, it's this framework, it's a particular way of viewing things or analyzing phenomena within phonology. Never mind the details, but essentially through a rejigging of constraints, these are categories of constraints, so I'm cheating a little bit here. We can distinguish between or amongst native versus earlier versus later loanwords, at least to some extent. Again, it's not a perfect system, but if we were to run this through an AI, we would have a greater than chance correct prediction. Phonotactics. So one way of looking at it is we try to see within all the lexicon or the various lexical layers within Armenian, we can actually figure out what lexical layer a word ought to belong to just with the phonotactic cluster. So again, by the way, the little r just means rare. Usually it means that I was only able to find 1 or 2 or 3 such instances. So this is initial p, initial ts, initial aspirated ts. So we can go on and on, but essentially there are differences within the phonotactic constraints for each lexical layer. Now, also for metathesis, there's a rule in lexical layers 1 and 2 where there's a peculiar kind of metathesis where Armenian sh, h, and r, h, so r, come from Persian sources hush and hr. Again, but things become a little messy because if we compare Persian loanwords in neighboring non-Indo-European languages such as Georgian, we see that there are in fact plenty of exceptions, and sometimes we can even figure out that the Armenian loanword is perhaps not even from Persian directly and may have come from another non-Persian source. And there are also other complications because even within the expected lexical layer, we do see certain irregularities or exceptions. Case morphology, now this one's a bit more straightforward. So the earlier loans often undergo the differentiation between tonic and pretonic position, and it regularly undergoes ablaut in different case markings, such as demk, dimats, nominative singular, genitive singular. whereas later loanwords essentially are completely regular. So this is what you would expect. It's the same thing in virtually any modern Indo-European language that happens to have case. And then for reduplication, it's a complicated thing because you have full reduplication, you have partial reduplication. But again, there are minor differences between the earlier versus the later loanwords and the native stock. In the interest of time, I'm kind of going to skip over quite a few things. So yeah, thank you for the notes here. I do see in the chat section. We can talk about it during the discussion. Yeah, so a brief quantitative analysis reveals inconclusive results for at least some of the 14 elements which I examined. So right now in this presentation, I just quickly went over just 5. So this leads me to conclude that there's been a relatively high degree of nativization for all Persian loanwords and even later ones, especially compared to what came after in the spoken language, such as, from other sources, English, French, Turkish, Russian, Arabic. Of course, Eastern and Western Armenian here will differ more and more the further we go in time. The sheer passage of time and the counterintuitive changes make Armenian particularly a hard case for positing clearly defined co-phonologies compared to most other examples in the literature. And so with important caveats, of course, we can identify bundles of properties and alterations that are exclusive to a particular stratum. But for the Persian layers, if we want to go deeper within the layers, it becomes harder to distinguish between the first and the second stratum, but it's fairly easy to discern the third from 1 and 2. And yeah, so this is more or less what one would expect, where the earlier layers exhibit quirkier behavior. So this is which are more reminiscent of Armenian's innermost lexical core, and the later layers exhibit more predictability and more regularity. On the other hand, the phonotactics of the inner layers is more limited, so stricter, for at least certain configurations of consonants, which is not what the model does predict that, but again, Armenian has some additional difficulties here. So yeah, this is about it for my presentation. Thank you for listening, and I will make note of whatever feedback you guys have. So thank you very much.